I am outside the Russian embassy because I've been waiting for my Russian visa here for a long time in Kazakhstan, and I thought I'd bring a passport. And it seems particularly fitting to talk about passports here in Kazakhstan because one of the first passports, well, early forms of passports that were issued was the Paisa. Now this was a small metal token that allowed people to travel across the Mongol Empire. Well, more than that, anyone who carried the tokens were also given supplies and horses, and this allowed for quick travel across the Mongol Empire. But travel documents long predate the Mongols. That allegedly goes back to biblical times, but say for instance in the 11th century, Jews living in Muslim land were apparently very punctual paying their taxes, and that's because after they paid their taxes they were given a receipt, and this receipt acted as a travel document and allowed them to travel to the Holy Land. But also before that, many foreign pilgrims also needed a travel document before travelling to the Holy Land. For instance, Saint Willibald in the 8th century travelled to Syria on what was called an armen. But by the time Saint Willibald arrived in Syria, the government had changed and he needed a high-ranking Spaniard living within Syria to vouch for him. And a lot of the institutions that offered pilgrims passports, or at least travel documents, like the Confraternity of Pilgrims to Rome, they still exist, and many pilgrims travelling on the St. James Way through Spain today still collect passport stamps. So there were international agreements requiring travel documents for centuries, but if you look at the Crusades, pilgrims during the Crusades often reported that they were given full body checks when they entered places like Alexandria, for instance. So you can see a lot of the procedures are very similar back then as to what they are today. However, travel documents weren't only needed to travel to other countries, but also to some other cities. Now these were usually in the form of an invitation from a high-ranking member of society, and of course they were checked at the city walls. But some lords also had toll roads, so you needed travel documents in order to enter their land. And in a book on the defortification of Germany by a historian named Monsker, he details in the 18th century how German guards on city walls would often beat up people if they didn't have the right documents. But it was the English who came up with the first national form of safe passage document in 1414, and the monarchs of England would for centuries personally sign these documents asking foreign nations to give the traveller safe passage. But these were usually only given to the aristocracy, and for poor people, border controls were flimsy at best. For instance, Elizabeth I said that, well, she ordered that all immigrants be deported from London, so it's clear that a lot of people were coming in illegally. But by the 19th century, after the Industrial Revolution, when more and more people could travel, and after most nations in Europe were centralised and a lot of the aristocracy lost their form of power, border controls became nearly non-existent for a long time, and passports just weren't needed. That is until some nations began either deporting people or banning certain people from entering their country. For instance, Bismarck's expulsion of the Poles or the American anti-Chinese law. But the regulations were very confusing. For instance, a Canadian needed a passport to go to Britain, but an American didn't need one to go to Canada. And it wasn't really until after World War I, when soldiers required documents, that the League of Nations decided to make all nationalities require passports. And one funny thing from this early time period of passports is photos didn't have any regulations. So if you ever get the chance, look some of these old passport photos up because they can be pretty funny at times. But going back to the 19th century briefly, for a long time Britain stood against passports. After all, many people had travelled around the world without ever needing one. So when Belgium asked for physical descriptions to be given to passports, or added onto passports, Lord Palmerston, who was then Foreign Secretary and later Prime Minister, said the ideas of passports were so repugnant that he could not propose it to the English people. And later on, the Times said, after Prussia introduced new passport controls, said that an Englishman believes that his presence in the shape of 5'9" of respectability on any spot on Earth's surface is proof enough that he must once have been born and had a name. He therefore cares little for his passport. So for a long time, the British just didn't follow other nations' passport controls.